We now have keynote speeches from Dame Sally Coates and Lord Farmer. And really, we're very pleased to welcome them both to the CJA members meeting. I mean, as you're all probably familiar, both of them have undertaken some sterling work and produced two very important and respected reviews, one on prison education and the other on strengthening family ties. So, as I mentioned before, I'm going to invite Dame Sally to speak first and then Lord Farmer. Just a brief introduction to Dame Sally. As many of you know, Dame Sally was appointed by the then Secretary of State for Justice, Michael Gove, to conduct an independent review into prison education in 2016. The review reported its findings in May 2016, and since then the review has had quite a significant influence on government policy in relation to education in prisons. A little bit of a background about Dame Sally. She's been teaching since 1976 and served as the principal of a number of schools in London. In September 2014, Dame Sally joined United Learning and is National Director of Secondary Education. And currently, Dame Sally serves as a trustee for the Unlock Graduate Scheme, the National Citizen Service, and the Twinning Project. And can I say, actually, Dame Sally, when I was doing some research in Hatfield Prison around about 2016, and the people there were very excited that your review people were about to turn up the week after, actually, to interview them all about prison education. So I do kind of remember it quite notably there. So I'd invite Dame Sally to just to talk to us about prison education review and where you think things are up to. So very good to see you, Dame Sally.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. I'm delighted to see Nina again and to speak to the CJA this afternoon. So, as you say, my review was in 2016. Just to give a little bit of background about why I was asked to do the review was basically because I was my job is education, working in schools. I knew Michael Gove of old because obviously he'd been Secretary of State for Education, and education is very much at the forefront of his thinking. And I think when he became Justice Secretary, he absolutely wanted to look at education in prisons. And it just so happened that I wrote to him because a Year 11 student whom I'd been responsible for in one of my schools had been put into youth custody during his GCSE year. And I'd felt very frustrated because this very bright boy from he'd been in care for most of his life, and had, obviously came from a very, very disadvantaged background. In fact, the care homes had changed frequently, so he had very little stability. He'd got involved in crime. He was put into Feltham. I tried to, by going to court when his court hearing, tried to get him put out on bail, but they didn't agree with it. And so then for the next 6 months, I attempted to get him to do his GCSEs from Feltham and get in study books and teachers and things like that to him without any success. And in fact, on the day of all of his GCSEs, he failed to sit one single GCSE because the prison was either in lockdown or they got the wrong paper or everything went wrong basically for him. And he was a child that would have got A stars if he'd been in school at the time. He was extremely bright. So I felt really cross about it, because when he was then released without charge in late June of that year, he had no GCSEs, hadn't taken any, and he obviously just went straight back into crime. Otherwise, if he got them, he could have gone on to sixth form and might have changed his life. Education changes lives, we all know that. It closes down barriers, it opens up opportunities, and that 16-year-old boy, 2 years later, committed another very serious crime and is now in prison for life. But I feel there was that point when he was on the edge of a cliff where if he'd been able to have the education that he should have had, I might have prevented that kind of fall over the cliff. And now I don't know how long his sentence is, but it's very significant, and he'll never achieve what he should have achieved. And the circumstances of his birth, in a way, dictated the path he took. And I felt like education could have changed that, and it didn't. So I spoke to Michael Gove probably pretty passionately at the time about it. I was very angry, and he then asked me to do a review of education in prison. So I'd never been in a prison before. I knew nothing about education in prison. So I went into it with very fresh eyes. And it changed my life really, because I actually saw the result of the kind of pipeline from my schools, from education into prison, of the children who are permanently excluded, the children who did get involved in crime, what happened, and how that path from permanent exclusion led very easily into kind of youth custody and then into adult prisons. I found education to be, from somebody that's used to mainstream education, I found education to be in a very poor state. I would say, I think my review kind of conveys that. There were some excellent things, and I saw some great lessons. I saw some great teachers. I met some governors who were passionately involved in it and people who really cared. But I also met the opposite. I met prison officers who didn't take prisoners to education, prisoners shut in cells for long periods of time. The route to the prison education block was quite a long route quite often, and prisoners just didn't get there because they had nobody to supervise and take them there. I found drab, bare classrooms, teaching by worksheet, no continuity, and the prisoners just jumping through hoops of different qualifications which were on offer, which weren't necessarily the ones they needed to take. I saw 4 main providers. Again, they were okay, I suppose. It varied obviously on the people that were actually working in each prison, but there's no variety, no competition. And I saw a lack of autonomy and accountability, and even care or concern by staff and governors. So I was pretty depressed by it, to be honest. I think members of my review were, and that's when we visited prisons. We did get a bit of a red carpet. We did probably see prisons at their best in terms of the education block, because all the teachers were on standby and everybody was ready to put on a great show. But all I could do is compare it to what I saw every single day in mainstream classrooms in our schools and colleges, and compare it, and it didn't compare at all. And if we really believe that education changes lives, if we provide prisoners with education, then they could have a hope of changing their lives. And I talked to lots of prisoners who were full of hope. They wanted to change their lives. I know the reality is often very different, but they had the optimism. They wanted to make a difference. They didn't want to go back into crime, but it felt like it was just nothing was going to stop it happening. So I did my review, and that was, as you say, 5 years ago now. What's changed? Well, I'm not completely up to scratch with all the small things that may have changed, but I would say a few things have changed. They did retender to education providers. My hope was that they would use further education colleges, schools in the area, a whole variety of different providers would be brought in, so to work with the context of each prison. However, they went back to the same 4 providers who are now providing education in prisons. So, they did the gesture of retendering, but it didn't change anything particularly. Governors do have some autonomy now. They have more autonomy perhaps than they had before. They have some money that they can spend, in different ways to suit the context of their prisons. Although again, it's still controlled centrally on the whole. Prisoners do have individual learning plans, or supposed to, and be assessed when they enter prison. And so their journey of education can be mapped out. I'm not sure how much that's actually systematically done. And probably lastly, and perhaps the most difference, is the unlocked graduate scheme, which as you say, I'm on the board for, which is a graduate scheme of prison officers coming into prison, working on the wings, because I felt very much that we have to change what happens in the wing, because that's where prisoners spend the vast majority of their time, and certainly during the last year and a half during lockdown, some prisoners have not left their wing. And so therefore, although it's great to think about changing the teachers, which is something else I think should definitely happen and was one of my recommendations, to look more at that, actually, if you change the people that are working with the prisoners, most of the time, change their approach to education, change the way they behave and their attitudes, then it's going to make a big difference. And so the Unlocked Graduate Scheme, which is in a lot of prisons now up and down the country, I think is very successful, and I think that should be rolled out more. So what do I think should happen? So first of all, education needs to be central to prisons. At the moment, I totally understand you've got to stop prisoners escaping, you've got to stop them harming themselves, you've got to deal with mental health and all the very many issues. And obviously being a governor is a very challenging job and running a prison. But until education is central, we're never going to really change mindset. So it has to be at the heart of the culture. And in order to put it at the heart of the culture, it has to be measured, has to be transparent, and we need to have clear data. And governors absolutely need to have autonomy, and they, as well as accountability. So the retendering, it when it does happen, should go to a huge variety of different providers, I think, with governors having far more say, and local FE colleges and schools and all those sort of people and places should be used to educate people in prisons. But you've got to get prison officers wanting to motivate to take prisoners to the education block. So if education is not at the heart of the culture, that first step won't happen of getting them to the teachers. So it's got to be, and in order to put it at the heart, it's got to be measured and people have got to be accountable for the data. Secondly, we do need better teachers. There needs to be a massive campaign, I think, by the country, by the government, to get teachers into prison. Actually, I think it's a really fulfilling, worthwhile job to teach in prisons. Lots of teachers complain about workload. Well, you can't take work out of prisons and you can't necessarily bring work in. So actually your work gets done during the day. But I think we need to get some really good teachers or people considering teaching in our prisons. And so there needs to be a kind of teach first kind of something or other, some sort of campaign to get really good teachers in. It's really important that we have good internet access. I feel very strongly during the lockdown, for example, schools all over the country went into remote education, some more successfully than others, but we've all got really good at it. There's fantastic programs out there, personalized programs for practically everything, every GCSE, every A-level subject, every sort of literacy, numeracy, everything is out there on the internet, every degree courses, etc. For example, the Open University stuff. And what did we have during lockdown in prisons? Worksheets delivered under doors or packs of stuff which was never marked, because we haven't got internet access in most of our prisons. And if we can get, I mean, nothing beats a teacher in a classroom, but second to that is remote education, which is personalised. So prisoners in their cells, regardless of whether they're locked down or not, can do work if they're motivated to do it. And there must be ways that we can make this safe. And I know how risk averse everybody is, and I don't know how much it would cost. But honestly, I think it would it would transform what happens in our prisons. And I know lots and lots of education providers that would for free provide all sorts of programs through the internet. So I think that absolutely has to happen. Education needs to be geared to employment for the vast majority of prisoners. I mean, there are some prisoners, of course, who will never probably be employed or in prison for such a long period of time. And so that is a bit different. But for the vast majority of prisons, everything they do should be certificated in some way. So if they're working in the prison kitchens or working on the grounds, they should have an MVQ. It should be attached to it. So there's employability certification happens, and they gain skills so that as well as perhaps being able to, if they're foreign, being able to speak English as a second language, they can actually go out and get a job. And so therefore, I felt very frustrated that you couldn't do driving theory. Lots of people are in prison for driving without license, dangerous driving, etc. And they can drive probably, but they've never done the driving theory. That's all done over the online, isn't it? There must be a way of in prisons people being able to do a driving theory and practice and be prepared for that. So at least they can then do a test and drive safely. There need to be CSCS card or whatever it is. Lots of prisoners want to work on building sites, but you can't do that because it's over the internet. And success breeds success. And if they succeed in small ways, small modules, and you can do things like resilience, confidence, life skills, CV writing, all those sort of things, people's self-confidence, self-esteem will rise. and they're more likely to be successful in terms of their character and staying at things when they leave. So lots of things should happen. And finally, I would say that through the gate needs to be much more joined up. It's soul destroying, really, to hear people in prisons talk about what happens when they leave the prison, and then nothing, you know, like they go straight out basically to the pub, or like, you know, homeless on the street. It's really difficult, that through the gate bit, and it needs to be much more joined up. So I know that Ofsted and Charlie Taylor are now looking again at doing some sort of review in prison, which is good if they're looking at it again. But what I would really like to see is some action and some things happening. We can do reviews and keep things ticking over forever. What we now need to do is actually make some change. So it needs some money in order to, and it needs the government to really understand that working with prisons is never perhaps going to be a populist thing to do, but actually, if we can change reoffending, we prevent further victims, and they need to look at it from that perspective, even if they don't want to look at it from the prisoner's perspective. So everybody deserves a second chance, and I don't think we go far enough to prevent reoffending, save our country money, and prevent further victims. So I would like somebody from the government. We need another Secretary of State, really, who's prepared to really get a grip on this and make some changes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dame Sally. Thank you very much for that. As I said before, if you have any kind of questions, then please put them in the chat. But also, we'll come to those questions after we've heard from Lord Farmer, and I'll explain the protocol for doing the questions in a moment. So, if I can turn now to Lord Farmer, who's going to talk about his review into family ties and the importance of those, and just a very kind of quick biographical summary. So Lord Farmer has been a Conservative peer since October 2014. In the House of Lords, he's focused on social justice issues, including family stability, welfare reform, children in, leaving care, and domestic abuse. And he published the final report from the review in 2017, looking at male prisoners and family ties to prevent reoffending and reduce intergenerational crime, and then produced the review for women in 2019. And he currently works closely with the Ministry of Justice and HMPPS on the implementation plan for both the reviews. So very warm welcome, Lord Farmer, and the floor is yours, as it were.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to the CJA for inviting me. And it was very good to hear Dame Sally and her passion. She's still got that passion for education in prisons. And I would just maybe start to begin with that her review was probably an inspiration to myself and my helper, Dr. Samantha Callan, who came from the Centre for Social Justice, who's been a great help to me, an academic, which I'm not, in pressing for my reviews and carrying them out. Why my reviews were carried out and what they found. I mean, you sort of touched on it. A key motivator for my becoming involved in politics over 15 years ago was the very high and concerning levels of family and relationship breakdown in this country, and the lack of a government strategy to address it. I think we were 5th from bottom of the OECD, 32 countries in family breakdown. However, families are structured, the relationships within them have an enduring effect on our lives, and any loss of these can be very hard for children and adults to bear. Centre for Social Justice research, which controlled for factors such as socio-economic status and ethnicity, found those who experience family breakdown in their childhood or youth are over twice as likely to experience homelessness, to be in trouble with the police, or to spend time in prison. Around a quarter of families with dependent children are headed by a single parent, which has perhaps normalized relationship breakdown, and father absence is a large and largely ignored problem in this country, affecting around 1 million children per year. Whilst lack of money is a major problem facing 2/3 of single parents, lack of a co-parenting relationship to ease the load is a less readily acknowledged challenge. Having a partner and the father of one's children unavailable because he is in prison is a major additional strain. But at least the norm is for male prisoners' children to be cared for by the other parent. Whilst the children of only 1 in 25 fathers in prison are not living with their mothers, the dependent children of 3/4 of women in prison are not looked after by their fathers. Behind that statistic is a bleak relational landscape for many imprisoned women. Ministry of Justice research found relationships are their biggest criminogenic need. If a woman has bad relationships and lacks good relationships, this puts her at greater risk of reoffending. The prevention of intergenerational crime was also part of my remit on both reviews. When imprisoned parents are unable to find alternative caregivers who can provide children with the safe, stable, and nurturing relationships they need to thrive, and they are taken into the care system, familial relationships can wither further. Children raised in care are grossly overrepresented in prison statistics. The lack of support care-experienced adults often endure whilst carrying out their sentences is harrowing. Josh McAllister's independent review of children's social care is focusing on the importance of relationships. This is welcome and overdue, but this emphasis also needs to be woven through many other areas of government policy. Hence my call for the importance of family and other relationships to be the golden thread running through the processes of the criminal justice system. When families are only considered in the mechanics of providing visits and as a tangential aspect of prison life, their value will not be at the forefront of those leading on and delivering all the other functions within the prison. Yet relationships impinge on all areas within an establishment and throughout the criminal justice system. The Ministry of Justice's own research found that prisoners who received family visits were 39% less likely to reoffend than those who do not. Family and other relationships can be valuable rehabilitation assets. However, the neglect of this pillar of rehabilitation and the almost exclusive attention given to employment and education fostered a wholly unacceptable inconsistency towards families across the prison estate, which my first review challenged. I talked about good relationships with families and significant others as the third leg of the rehabilitation stool, which brings stability and structure to the prisoners' lives, particularly when they leave prison. Without the motivation and sense of responsibility, family ties can inculcate in men who may never have seen the point of learning or grafting in lawful work. Efforts to help them turn their lives around may yield little fruit. So with the male review, published 4 years ago, as we've mentioned, the key priority was to help men develop a sense of responsibility towards their children and other members where this might be lacking. In other words, if you've got a prisoner in his cell for 6 years, the tendency was to shrug their shoulders and say, there's nothing I can do. Whereas to inculcate that sense of responsibility that there was much they could do, for instance, storybook dads or something like that, I saw as one of the prime purposes of the male review. In terms of progress or lack of progress made since the reviews, I can't go into detail, but we do meet every 6 months to discuss how implementation is proceeding. When I say we meet with HMPPS officials and go over the implementations that my reviews made and how progress is being made. This ongoing interest of the reviewer 4 years on makes it much harder for recommendations to gather dust. And indeed, at our last meeting, which was a couple of weeks ago, they said that it was quite unusual for a reviewer to keep to be in touch with them, in contact with them, and reviewing their progress like this. And actually, it was an incentive for them to work on. So that was good. Also, the bigger goal of a shift in culture will actually take several years to embed, rather like a big ocean liner turning around. It takes time. It could even be a couple of decades. COVID has hindered and helped the suspension of social visits and ongoing restrictions where they have recommenced make the experience much more fraught. More positively, on the technology front, the rapid deployment of 700 laptops enabled families to see each other and will remain available throughout the prison system and hopefully increased. So COVID enabled my recommendations for video calling to clear hurdles which might otherwise have taken several years. The whole organization approach, which has been adopted in the implementation phase of both reviews, means that all prisoners now publish a families and significant others strategy, which has to include various elements stipulated in the review, including family learning, which is where the overlap with wider education comes in. Key worker training now includes developing appropriate personal relationships with prisoners, undertaking informal support for their family ties, awareness of how to help care experienced men with the psychological and other issues they often face. Such a trauma-informed approach is even more important for women in the criminal justice system, who have often experienced abuse and trauma, which can profoundly impact their ability to develop and sustain healthy, trusting relationships. And this abuse can be ongoing. During this second female review, the need to gather information about these relationships, any children in her care, and other circumstances, such as her accommodation, became particularly salient. Over half of women in custody have dependent children. If mothers are to be enabled to continue to shoulder these responsibilities and encouraged to do so where necessary, we need to know who and where their children are. More progress needs to be made in this area. Another recommendation that needs to secure funding in this spending round is for female prisons to have their own resident social workers. As one prison governor on the female estate told me, I don't want more prison officers, I want social workers and family engagement workers. The need for social workers should certainly be prioritized in the upcoming white paper. And just looking ahead to that, I'll give a list of what we need. In terms of the physical fabric of the prison estate, we need to ensure that there is somewhere children can play outside when visiting. We need private spaces where women with security clearance can have unsupervised contact with children and, e.g., make a meal, play with them. We need visitor centers as standard so that visitors are not forced to wait in the rain or queue up outside or have nowhere to sit or to change a baby or use toilet facilities. My first ever visit to a prison was before I did the reviews, was actually to Parkhurst. And there was a little door in the wall, and inside there was just a room, a very small room with the prison officers who were taking down your name and confirming your booking, and hardly any chairs. And you had grannies and grandfathers coming from London, stressed. It was very unwelcoming and in fact very stressful. So we need proper visitor centers as a liminal space, connecting the outside world to the closed world that they're just about to go into. We need to treat distance from home as a factor when moving prisoners. We need women's prisons layout and level of upkeep needs to be conducive to good mental health, not deprioritized in comparison with male facilities. We heard in some of the female prisons that, and the fabric was very, very poor, roofs and walls and windows, etc. And it seemed to be that they were after the male estate. They were at the end of the funding for that. We need an airport-style customer service for visitors, very courteous and considerate, as well as security conscious. We need now removal of perspex and other screens, etc., once COVID is over, as a priority, so they aren't retained for spurious security reasons. We need to remember safety and security is about care of vulnerable prisoners. 2, safer custody lines need to work every time and family concerns passed on. Families drawn into the assessment, caring, custody and teamwork processes as the norm. So in summary and in closing, and going back to culture again, the white paper has to acknowledge the importance of relationships as the golden thread, which needs to run through all processes of prisons and probation, as government commitment and understanding of that is a fundamental requirement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Farmer. Thank you for that and for taking us so carefully through all those kind of recommendations that you've outlined there. Okay, so this is an opportunity for people attending the meeting to ask questions to James Sally or Lord Farmer. I'm just having so I think the way we're planning to do this is if you have a question, then you can kind of raise your hand. I think Jamie, our comms officer, membership officer, will kind of, as it were, give you opportunity to actually sort of read your question aloud. And I can see that there's a question here for Dame Sally from Alex Rose from Standout. So I'm thinking, Jamie, if you could perhaps, as it were, unmute Alex, then Alex can kind of ask his question, and then we can ask Dame Sally to reply to that.
Good morning, all, and good morning, Dame Sally. I was just curious as to your thoughts as to when the re-tendering for the education contracts went out. Why? Just some thoughts on as to why it was that it just gravitated back to the big fours, and why. Well, it sounds like there was a missed opportunity, and I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts as to why that opportunity to bring some more creative, smaller providers in wasn't taken up. Thank you.
I mean, it's a really good question, Alex. And to be honest, you know, I can take a cynical approach and say it was just the easiest thing for them to do. Those 4 main providers, and you know, there's some real strengths in the 4 main providers. They're very used to working in prisons. They've got a very well laid out plan. They've got experience and history, etc. They probably made, you know, perhaps the best bids for it. I don't know. I just think it was the easiest way to go. I was really disappointed that happened. I've got no problem with the 4 main providers not being part of it, but I can't understand why they didn't take the risk, if you want, and make a braver decision of saying, because there were other people that put bids forward, much smaller groups. And I wasn't involved, unfortunately, in it at that point. Lord Farmer's made the point of how he stayed in contact. I've kind of tried to stay a bit in contact, but perhaps not systematically as he has, and perhaps I should have done, because I was really disappointed that they didn't go with, you know, some local providers to the prison, and it would have been so much better, I think. But so I don't really completely know why, except that it's just the easy route, I think, for them to have taken. But, you know, it was a big fuss and all that stuff about going back to retendering and then just to go back with the same people. Definitely a missed opportunity.
Okay. Thanks so much, Sally, and also thank you for your question, Alex. So just to say, I think on the chat, there's been some kind of comment about the dynamic purchasing framework, which I think some people have contributed to as a possible vehicle for smaller organizations to get involved in, but clearly that's not always that easy for organizations to use. I'm going to go to Diane from POPs. She's got kind of comment on the question, I think, in relation to the reports from Dame Sally and Lord Farmer. So if we can perhaps, Jamie, if we're going to mute Diane, if you can find her. I'm sure she's there somewhere.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Hi, Diane. Okay,
Hi.
your question. to Lord
Yeah,
Farmer,
it was
Sally.
more of a comment really rather than a question, and I
Okay.
did put a question mark at the end of it, so it kind of turned it into a question. But it was really just to say that we appreciate obviously the reviews from Dame Sally Coates and obviously from Lord Farmer in relation to families and relationships and the potential for positive impact on those who are in prison. We took part as an organisation in and with Lord Farmer and the review team. And we were grateful to be involved, and there was a lot of work undertaken and recommendations which were embraced and agreed to be implemented by HMPPS. My point really is that we were starting to move collectively as a group of agencies working alongside other agencies to implement and support the implementation of those recommendations. What's happened obviously is that COVID has impacted, has slowed that down. And we appreciate that, but we're now 19 months since COVID hit at the prisons in relation to visitation and family and relationships. And what we're finding is, and what my fear is, and I can only speak on behalf of POPs, is that we may be in that very difficult situation of potentially not ever returning to how Lord Farmer's recommendations envisaged that visitation, contact and relationships, just positive relationships with our loved ones, will ever return back to normal. Hold that thought. That's a question we don't know, but we're not feeling the energy. We're not feeling the desire collectively across the patch to return back to visitation. Visits are now up and running, but they're up and running in very limited contact situations. They're up and running only one per month if you're lucky enough to pass the barriers of lateral flow tests, etc. Prior to your visit. There's still no play provision for children and activities. There's still no refreshments in many of the prisons. And all that on top of now the potential for the reduction of the introduction of laptops and video calls and free telephone calls, all now coming to an end, which on the one hand stands us in good stead because we think we're coming through to the end of this process. But at the same time, we can't see the same parallel of visits and contact with our loved ones being increased. So families at the minute are actually in a worse position than they was 19 months ago as COVID implications hit. So it was really to make that statement that we're not out of the woods in relation to family ties and how we engage families. In fact, it now needs more work collectively than ever to ensure that we're not left behind as the rest of the world, the rest of the country starts to at least begin to learn to live with COVID and deal with that within our own relationships and social activities. So it was more a statement, but to say that there's a lot of work to be done because families still don't have contact with their loved ones, generally speaking, right now.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Lord Farmer, do you want to come back on that?
Firstly, it's great to see Diane. I was due to see her up in Manchester last week, and she wasn't well, but I'm glad to see she's firing on all cylinders there. And we missed you in Manchester, Diane.
Likewise.
Glad to see you're back fighting. And she's got a very good point, and it's a very good point, and it's something that we're raising certainly in the implementation committee. I should say, to give HMPPS their due, there has been, and we've been part of a sort of recovery committee, which meets almost every 2 or 3 weeks to see what's going on in prisons and how we can recover back to where we were before, or even at a better place. And this getting back to that and not allowing the COVID regulations to sort of become set is an important part of what we've been talking about. So I would just here mention that the prison service, probably more than other areas, has certainly been curtailed by Public Health England, NHS, who have had a sort of controlling authority over what might be done and what might not be done. And of course, family visits and those sort of things have been seriously affected there. So just to say to Diane, there are a lot of people aware that progress needs to be made. I think we're itching to make it as soon as it's viable. These things do take a bit of time, but this is an opportunity to put in place some good recommendations now as we start again. So the point she raises is not ignored. We don't want to keep on with perspex screens. We don't want to carry on with those sort of things. We want the visits to come back, etc., etc. So we'll fight on. She can fight on. Everyone else can fight on, and we'll get there. It's changing the culture. We've got a new prison minister, haven't we? And a Secretary of State for Justice. So we have to go and persuade them to follow us. Okay.
Thank you very much, Diane and Lord Farmer. So I think there's a question from Marie Claire from New Leaf. So Jamie, if perhaps you could unmute Marie Claire, then she can ask a question.
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Lord Farmer, and hi Sally as well. Got questions for both, but I'm going to focus on Lord Farmer for now. Okay. I was just wondering, you mentioned about the committee that meets regularly, and I just wondered about a voice from the people that we're talking about all the time, whether they have a presence, whether they have an input, because we are currently in the process of galvanising the country's first ever peer-led visitors council at HMP Birmingham, which we received funding from Barry Cadbury. And some of the solutions and recommendations that are coming from the families and visitors that we're speaking to include really easy wins, such as updating the prison websites because they're so out of date and they've got, 3-year-old information on them about regime information and visitors' times. And things like using social media, which some prisons are doing really, really well. For example, HMP Hull has a really forward-thinking governor, Ralph Lukowski, brilliant at keeping families and visitors up to date with what's going on, COVID numbers, so on and so forth, whilst other prisons are severely lacking in that kind of, I want to say innovative, but is it really innovative, in that kind of common sense approach? So I just wondered, A, whether there's a presence for families to have, whether there's a way that families can have a voice at these meetings, and B, how much pressure you can put on to have these simple wins implemented across the country.
Yeah, thanks, Marie Claire. I would just say these meetings are fairly small. It's really me and Samantha, my advisor, meeting three or so officials who are sort of in charge of implementation. So there isn't, if you like, a prisoner's voice there. That's not to say that that we can't at our next meeting raise this issue and say that we should hear, as we should have a visitor's voice as to what's working, what isn't working, etc., and whether there's any particular area that's completely being missed. But just as you say, it's not rocket science, it's common sense, and we're trying to get that embedded in the system. And we aren't getting the feedback, particularly during COVID. We haven't, but I hear what you say, and I'll raise it.
Well, if you are interested as well, Lord Farmer, we've run a couple of consultations during COVID around prison communication and stuff like that. I'd be happy to forward that for you. Was that?
Yeah. Prison communications are very important. Yeah. Thanks very much, Mary Claire.
Okay, thanks, folks. So I think what would be our final question actually for this session from Laurie Hunt. So Jamie, again, if you can unmute Laurie, and then Laurie can ask his question, which is about education.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And this really is a question for Dame Sally. And really good to hear what you were saying and the passion that you had for prison education. I work for the Transition to Adulthood Alliance, which focuses on 18 to 25-year-olds in the justice system, primarily due to their continuing maturity past the age of 18. And my question is quite a simple one. What should there and how could there be a focus on young adult education in or developing education services for young adults, specifically in the prison estate?
Yeah, absolutely there should, Laurie. I mean, the fact of the matter is that a lot of children and young adults in prison dropped out of school or were permanently excluded from school, or actually, dislike, if not hated school. The classroom experience is something that you put them in a classroom, those same shutters come down, they go back into the same mindset, particularly when they've also got a teacher who may not be very skilled and hasn't got any resources that they can use that are kind of interactive in any way. So I think there needs to be a real focus on how and what is delivered, particularly to 18 to 25-year-olds, who are the people that are going to come out probably spend the vast majority of their life back in society, and we want them to come out skilled, able to be good citizens and able to bring up their own families in the right way and things like that. So I think there has to be a lot of work done about making education applied education, if you like, as against just classroom-based education. So education which is actually literacy in practice, numeracy in practice, leading to something. So education which is kind of part of, so they're learning to be a painter and decorator, and they're learning literacy and numeracy in the same place rather than in a classroom, and it's all very different. So I think there really needs to be a focus on what is delivered and how it's delivered, particularly to those young adults, because they're the ones perhaps that need most to engage with education and often don't, because of the level of maturity, they're still very much in the gang kind of set mindset of not thinking about the futures, whereas we know post 25, they start to settle down, they've perhaps got children, they've got partners, and they start to think about the future. But that 18 to 25-year-olds is key, and often the most challenging prisoners to be dealing with. For example, in ISIS, which I think is a prison which does 18 to 30-year-olds, it's very difficult to get them to the education block because of the gang alliances they have to go past in order to get there, and the classroom that you have to put different gangs and different. It's madness, really. It's awful that it's very challenging to deliver education. So I think the more practical education is the better, really. And those, but yeah, you're absolutely right. They're the key group.
Thanks very much for that, James, and also Laurie for that question. Sorry, Lord Farmer, you want to come in very briefly, I think.
Yeah, just very quickly, again, to Marie Claire, which I just thought of actually. If governors can contact the National Families Advisor, which is Dr. Angela Christopher, and that if they can feed into her what's going well and what's not going well. So it's a place where people can share things, governors can share things. That's something that you should be aware of. She's very keen on families and that they work properly in the prisons, and so encourage the governors to contact her, the National Families Advisor, Dr. Angela Christopher.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, folks. So I know there are a couple more comments in the chat, and there's another question there, but I'm afraid we're going to have to move to the next session. So maybe if it's okay, Alex, but perhaps we could forward your question to Dame Sally afterwards. Perhaps Nina and Jamie could do that, and perhaps we can get an answer to you after the session. As I say, we need to move on. But thanks very much, Dame Sally and Lord Farmer, for attending and telling us about your work and also your thoughts on where things could go. Thanks for the questions that have come so far. And I know that you're busy, so you need to perhaps dash off to something else. But thanks very much on behalf of the members and the audience today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. And just to say that if you forward any questions to me, I'll happily answer them.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dave Sally. Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye. So just moving on to the next session, then we have our kind of the third bit of our meeting. So it's a panel session. So just to be aware that the the focus of this panel discussion is really around the question, what should the government include in its prisons white paper to improve education, training and employment support in prisons and strengthen family ties? I'd like to welcome Marie-Claire O'Brien, who's the founder and CEO of New Leaf Initiative, which specializes in supporting people from prison to employment via a pathway of education, training and holistic support. And Marie-Claire sits on the steering committee for the Prisoner Learning Alliance and also the Criminal Justice Alliance's Lived Experience Expert Group. And she's a Prisoners Education Trust alumni and a first class honours student from the University of Warwick. And she recently set up the New Leaf Network to engage people with lived expertise of the criminal justice system to support each other. So over to you, Marie-Claire.
Hi, thanks for having me here today, especially speaking with such an expert panel such as Dame Sally Coates and Lord Farmer. Yeah, one of the things that I'm really passionate about is prisoner education, and that's, I suppose, coming from a lived experience point of view, in that I was a prisoner many years ago, and education has played a key role in getting me to where I am today, really. So one of the things that New Leaf has always been focused on is how can we improve things in custody so that, you know, they translate into rehabilitative pathways for prisoners, because actually most prisoners do want to go straight, they do want to work, they just, I think, struggle to access the right training providers, the right pathways, the right sort of mentors to help them get there. One of the things that I discovered, or I suppose came across in my university studies, which was simultaneous with me starting up New Leaf, was the Dame Sally Coates Review. So she has played a fundamental part, I think, in a lot of my rationale and where I am today, in terms of, you know, how our organisation pushes for the rights and progression of prisoners, people with convictions. And one of the things we're really passionate about is the role that traineeships and apprenticeships can play in doing a lot of the things that Andy just mentioned, actually bridging that gap from prison into employment. So I've done a lot of work on this in terms of why isn't it happening. Everybody's on board, everybody thinks it's a great idea, HMPPS thinks it's a great idea, industry thinks it's great, and prisoners obviously think it's great because it's basically earning whilst you're learning. So everybody's a winner. And there was a few key blockers, actually. One of which was that prisoners, in order to access traineeships and apprenticeships, they have to be classed as employees. And that wasn't possible back in the day. There was just a blanket no-go from HMPPS in terms of, I think, a fear-based perspective around, if we give prisoners employment rights, then it opens up a legislative you know, Pandora's box that we're just not ever going to open. So then through relationships and networks outside of prison reform community, actually in the education sort of sector, I had some really interesting discussions around, well, if HMPPS won't allow that to happen, how about we go the other route and we approach the DfE and, you know, the people that write the rules, basically, in terms of the funding landscape, to change their wording, because quite often that was the problem, that the blockers were a simple paragraph in the funding rules that said a traineeship placement cannot be carried out in a prison environment, or, you know, prisoners cannot be classed as apprentices because they cannot legally be employed whilst they're incarcerated. So it really made sense to me that we kind of follow that path of least resistance. However, it's never as easy as it looks, and now we're 5 years down the line from the Dame Sally Coates Review, where she kind of, you know, black and white made these recommendations, and the sector's kind of fully got behind her with those, and we're still no further forward, it feels like. So it's very frustrating, and a little bit like hitting your head up against the brick wall. I think Dame Sally Coates said it really well when she said, you know, how many reports are we going to write before we actually just do it? As the great Nike philosopher said, just do it. So that's where we're at now, and I think what I'd really like to see is this white paper talking about the solutions rather than just shining a light on the problems again. We know what the problems are. We just need brave, forward thinkers to kind of put things into action. And for me, that's what the white paper should focus on: changing the legislation, changing the funding rules to simply include prisoners and people with convictions, so that we can open up traineeships and apprenticeships to this group. Never has it been more important to do this than now. I think we can all agree that we thought that COVID would do the opposite, and that we'd find that there was a real shortage of jobs, and that the employment market would be saturated, and that our people, our community, would sink to the bottom of an ever-growing pile of unemployed people. What we're actually finding is the opposite, that COVID has created a plethora of skill shortages and labour shortages in a variety of sectors, such as construction, hospitality, warehousing and logistics, so on and so forth. So we're seeing, you know, the country's economy suffering because of these skill shortages. You know, we just went through a petrol crisis because of not having enough lorry drivers and stuff. So it makes sense, I think, to look at the untapped talent pool that are people that are in prison, and look at ways to kind of help them to buoy the economy as opposed to being a drain on the economy. Yeah, that's where I stand on it. It's a common sense approach that I feel just needs to happen now. I held a round table just recently, actually, and we had some really key players around that table. We had the Ministry of Justice, we had City and Guilds, we had I can't remember what they're called, but we had some big lobbying groups in terms of education and employment groups that were all saying the same thing. There's actually a strategic group that was set up by the Association of Employment and Learning Providers, ALP, and that was focused on this prisoner apprenticeship pathway. Unfortunately, with COVID and, you know, a variety of changes, you know, at ministerial level, it's kind of fallen by the wayside. And I really think that with the government's rhetoric around Build Back Better, and being brave and innovative and, you know, solution focused, which is all my language, that we really need to revisit this, get these strategic groups back off the ground, and really talking about action rather than reports and further white papers that just repeat the last white paper. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but yeah, for me, traineeships and apprenticeships are the key mechanism that bridge the gap from a stagnant prison education system that is currently further disenfranchising prisoners by promising them jobs if they do this X, Y, and Z qualification, and actually when they come out into the community, does no such thing. In fact, they are unemployable with those qualifications, which further disenfranchises them and makes my job as also a training provider even harder, because they're like, well, why should we believe you? Well, actually, you can believe me because I'm an ex-prisoner that's got your best interests at heart. But you know, these are people that have been let down time and time again by the education system, and that shouldn't be happening just because the PEF providers want bums on seats because that's how they get paid. And that's the cynicism. Well, it's not even cynicism, it's reality. That's what's happening out there at the moment with our 80-odd thousand prisoners. We need to change that and turn it on its head, and we need to be listening to industry leaders and employers and fill in their gaps and, you know, providing their qualifications in the form of apprenticeships and traineeships. So that's all I'll say for now.
Great, thank you very much, Marie-Claire. And just to say, we'll come on to the questions later, but there's a question for you already, I think, in the chat. If you have a look at that, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, thanks for your contribution. Now we'll return to you in a moment, as I say. So our next panel speaker is Andy Keane-Downs. So welcome, Andy. He's the Chief Executive of the Prison Advice and Care Trust, and been there since 2005. And PACT supports people in prison, people with convictions and their families. And previously, Andy's held senior posts with the National Childbirth Trust and with Centrepoint. And interestingly, moved from Reuters in the City of London to work in the City of Manchester for a grassroots community education programme. And he currently acts as a pro bono advisor to the Catholic Church and others on criminal justice policy. So very warm welcome to you, Andy. You got your 10 minutes, so please try and keep to that if you can. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you. And well, it's hard act to follow, really, listening to Marie-Claire, somebody I admire very greatly, and Lord Farmer, and Sally Coates and everybody who's spoken so far. I've had to change pretty much everything I want to say, because when I come to these things, I want to hear something different from the last speaker. And essentially, I just want to say that I thoroughly agree with everything Marie Claire's said about apprenticeships, and everything that I've heard from Lord Farmer and Sally Coates, along with Diane, my good friend Diane Curry. I was also involved in the two Farmer reviews, and just to remind people, they involved the largest ever consultation with prisoners' families that has ever taken place in England and Wales, and also with serving prisoners, and with the expert agencies that have been working with families for decades. So I think in terms of the white paper, I suppose there's a kind of few key things, as well as the beating crime plan. I do feel it's essential and really incumbent on ministers that we don't think we're starting with a blank sheet of paper. You know, we have Farmer 1, we have Farmer 2, we have Coates, we have Lammy, we have Young, we have Corsten. You know, we have report after report after report, painstaking research, robust evidence about what works to support people, to help them turn their lives around in the criminal justice system. And we have a revolving door of ministerial teams, and those of us who've been doing this work for any length of time, you know, we can count them. And every time it feels like we start again. And it is crucial that we have evidence-based policy. Now, there's a huge amount of evidence that connects the agenda, the current agenda around employment and training and accommodation with family agenda. So it's worth us perhaps just starting there. We know from Home Office research dating back to the early 2000s that when researchers went out to find out, you know, what were the best drivers for people in prison to ensure that they got somewhere to live on release and a job, or a place on a training course. Time and time again, researchers went out with forms and questionnaires and looked at the hard data, and they ticked lots of boxes, but they found that the box marked other had the largest gap in it in terms of the data. And it was only when they looked into who other was, they discovered, unsurprisingly, it was prisoners' own families. We know also from the Joint Inspectorate report from HMI Prisons, Probation and Ofsted, they did the same thing, looking at prison leavers and what was it that worked to support them to get accommodation, training, or a job on release. And the most single effective resettlement agency, and I use the words from that report, was prisoners' own families. So unless we invest seriously in the Farmer agenda, in families, we are not going to achieve the kinds of outcomes that we want to achieve, because with the best will in the world, with all the fantastic organisations and the great people in prison and probation service working hard to get people into employment, if we miss families out, we miss out a huge piece of the solution. Lord Farmer very rightly pointed out that we have seen a lot of culture change around the prison system, and in probation under the dynamic framework now, we have well-being contracts that include family provision, and we're really proud. We think that the evidence we helped gather has informed and influenced that. And you know, the work of Dr. Angela Christopher around ensuring prisons have family strategies, all of that is great, fantastic. But the hard reality is that we have actually seen a disinvestment in family services over the last decade. We've had 2 Farmer reports, and in terms of real term spend, we're spending less on supporting prisoners' families in the criminal justice system than we did 10 years ago. And that is a reality that we have to face up to. It's not about, I'm afraid, business as usual. It is about listening to what Lord Farmer had to say. There is a massive case for investment, and that includes in the women's estate. Now, just to say something about the backdrop, because we need a reality check for all of this, don't we? So Dame Sally's pointed out that we do need IT, we need in-cell delivery of all of these programs, but actually we all know that education is relational. Getting people into a classroom is really, really important, or into a training workshop, wherever it is we want people to go. So we need a prison system that is safe and that is secure and that is decent. And that means we need prisons that are manageable, not overcrowded, not too big, in the right places, and not full of people who are mentally ill and disturbed. So prior to COVID, we had the highest rates of suicide, the highest rates of self-harm, and the highest rates of violence between prisoners and between prisoners and prison staff than we have ever seen. During COVID, we've seen the opportunities for violence have been restricted because people have been largely kept in their cells. But the impact on mental health has been extraordinary and is frightening, I think. One only has to look at what the Select Committee is saying on this, what Centre for Mental Health are saying about that. So the Prisons White Paper has to focus, I believe, on how we can divert more people in the courts from custody into a suitable mental health and substance misuse treatment, and how we can also identify and advocate for those people who have mental health systems in the system, but don't necessarily have a clinical diagnosis, but who have experienced huge trauma in their lives and who are often the most at risk of self-harming and suicide. What really disturbs me is that we're looking at a situation now where by 2026, the government is forecasting a prison population of about 100,000 people. Back in 1989, Douglas Hurd talked about the shocking rise of the prison population to 45,000. He was a Conservative Home Secretary who managed to reduce the prison population by over 10%. He reduced the prison population from 45,000 to 40,000. The next one who talked about reducing the prison population was David Blunkett. And I've got a quote from him. Current ministers might not want to hear from David Blunkett, but he said, we've had an increase from 40,000 to 71,000 over the last 7 years in the number of prison places, and a fat lot of use it has been in reducing crime and disorder. We're now at 79,000. We're heading for 100,000. And when we read on the BBC reports such as the one about the new proposed prisons in the Wethersfield Air Base in Essex, where it's proposed these two prisons will hold 3,400 men, part of a plan which anticipates demand rising by 18,000 in the next 5 years. That plan was being framed as being good news for the economy, bringing many benefits to the local community, such as hundreds of jobs during construction, careers within the prison sector, and an increased spend on local business. So if we want a prison system that is genuinely rehabilitative, that genuinely supports people to turn their lives around, to get a good job, to have a legal income, to have good, nurturing, pro-social, positive human relationships with people in their family or their loved ones, to feel like they're citizens in their local community. If we want to cut crime, it seems to, and we want to provide a system where people can deliver education, training, and good family work, we need to get a grip on the explosion of the prison population. And we need to set aside the story so far. We've got a new ministerial team. It's a golden opportunity to be a Douglas Hurd type Secretary of State and think, how can we reduce prisons? Because actually, if we do that well, everybody gains. The economy gains, taxpayers gain. We have fewer victims, and more people get a chance to live a good life, which is what the vast majority of people in our prison system want. Kevin, I could probably talk for another 6 hours on this.
I'm sure you could.
But how am I doing? How am I doing?
Well, actually, if you just pause and stop there, that'd be really helpful. Okay, and then we can we'll come back to you, Andrew, I'm sure.
All right,
but that was a kind of how can I say, that was a very eloquent sort of plea for a more sensible approach to to prisons. So we'll pick up on that a little bit later, I'm sure. But thanks for that for now. So we're going to move on to our final panel speaker today, and that's Nandi Phobi, who's a member of the Prisoner Learning Alliance Steering Committee, and you've been involved, I think, in rehabilitation and education delivery for the past 5 years. And interestingly, I think during your time at Mega Nexus, you were involved in the virtual campus, which offers education and employment in prisons in England and Wales. So over to you, Nandi.
Yes, hi, Kevin. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Yeah, during my time actually at Mega Nexus it was actually quite interesting because I did have a chance to kind of shape and steer how the education was delivered, given just how awful things were prior. Please don't tell him I said that. But it was done in a way that helped it to be consumed, because I was very conscious. I've got a similar story to Marie Claire. It's probably been about 3 years actually. I was once a service user within there. So I kind of gave that lens effectively inside custody. So yeah, so I'll move on from Mega Nexus times, but currently now where I am now, I'm with NEC Software Solutions. So we fundamentally deal with software solutions for public sectors and also the youth, and YJF, which is the Youth Justice Assessment Framework. So I've kind of taken a further step back into try how to help those from a younger age, but I'll expand a bit more on that later. But yeah, again, I'll start off by saying thanks for inviting me to share my opinions. Quite some powerful points raised from Sally Coates and Lord Farmer, also from Andy and Mary Claire, loads of points that I was actually agreeing to that I second. So thanks for that, Andy. It's quite a hard act to follow now. But I come from a bit of a more simplistic approach. I get there's policies, there's things like that within MLJ, but I'm more of a simplistic person. I look at it in a way that I always ask the question, because my background is actually technology. That's where I am now. That's where I'm trying to steer within the justice sector. However, I always ask myself this question: is technology a right or a luxury? Because where we are now, actually during my time actually in the PLA, we've actually been trying to influence the technology that is delivered within justice sector, but obviously due to one reason or another, personnel changes, or there's the challenges here and there, it makes it very hard. But I've probably been, for the past 3 to 4 years, I've been singing this tune, and unfortunately nothing has changed. I'm not a fan of reviews, although reviews do put light on concerns. I'm not really a fan of reports. I'm someone that I'm very pragmatic. I like to come at the approach, okay, what's the solution and how do we move forward? And that's fundamentally what my role is and how I'm kind of moving forward. And I always ask my question, is technology a luxury or right? And when you actually when you actually look at prison from a bird's eye point of view, you realize just how disjointed it is. I've gone to a few prisons. I visited a few prisons, spoken to a few governors. I've visited obviously education places and visiting centers. And what becomes apparent is that when you move from prison to prison, there's a tech disparity. And when it comes to that, is that there's no standard practice, there's no standard or minimum way to kind of implement or operate, or how it operates in each prison. And that has a detrimental effect that really affects how rehabilitation, how connections, how family ties are, because you can have a really good practice in prison with a brilliant governor that really wants to help service users and help not just service users, but also the officers really want to make a change. And you develop and you understand and you kind of adapt to that way of living. But then we all know that a journey inside custody is quite turbulent. You do move around, and if you do happen to change establishments, the tech changes as well. Education changes as well. Programs changes as well. things like this that makes things very, very hard. And we need to come to a realization is that things that are just simple has a massive domino effect. Just yesterday, I was talking to one of my colleagues actually, and I brought this question to him. I was like, so what's your thoughts on prison education and how things are inside custody? And he hasn't got the best understanding, but one thing that we kind of come to the agreement is that we need to get the basics right. Yes, I'm very techie in terms of how I think. I'm a bit Minority Report right now in terms of what we can do, but at the same time, the basics is what we need to start and work from there. There's loads of SMEs. During my time, I've actually spoken to several SMEs and large companies, small companies, charity sectors, and the tech is out there. The technology is out there to help aid a person going through the system, a person that wants to improve ties with families, a person that wants to help consume technology or also education in a way that suits them. Education, again, is fundamental. It should be at the heartbeat, as Sally Coates mentioned, should be the heartbeat to, or instrumental to a prison. But again, how it's consumed is not done in the right way. Technology, again, we mentioned devices earlier. Yes, in-cell technology is a must, but it's outside of that. It's outside of the cells. When you're in face-to-face with a teacher, how is it delivered? How are you receiving it? How is it done in a way that is tailored to your needs? Because we all learn in different ways. So we need to probably understand that from the top down. Culture change is massively important. Yes, we've had a change of our Secretary of State, but at the same time, we need to kind of really push forward our culture, really push forward our agendas into how the simplest things has the massive effect. Whole system approach. When I first actually listened to Robert Buckland, actually, one of the first sentences that he said, which kind of got me on board, was we have to implement a whole system approach. Obviously, things went downhill from then, but that was effectively my idea. That's an idea that I've always championed. That's an idea that I've always wanted to kind of push forward, and it's right from the beginning. And when I'm in the beginning, it's like before you even enter the estate, it's like, how is data captured? How is technology used in order to help assist you to get what you want? We've all kind of recognized there's that general consensus of through the gate. Through the gate is really, really far apart. The gap between through the gate and custody is so far, it's miles apart. Compared to was 3-4 years ago, it actually has narrowed a little bit, but it's still not where it should be. There should be some sort of system that can help that person that's going through the system to apply for jobs, to get the right understanding, to get the right support, to continue what they were doing in custody. Because I do speak to a few people that's recently been released, and I always want to get their opinion. I want to get, what's your thoughts? How do things are? And most of them say is that I actually feel that I get more support in custody. Like when they are out, they do tend to not know what to do. There is a very small percentage of people who actually do get the right support. But again, there are some that fall within that zone that struggle to know what to do and struggle to kind of pick up where they've left off. Because let's say you've been there for a few years, you've probably established a good routine, a good educational course, you probably get the right support, and you want to translate that into employment. But sometimes, given the challenges that are faced within these establishments, either, because for me, in my opinion, I think employees should come in to custody. They should come in, conduct interviews, have a chat, have a talk, find out what suits them. But sometimes if that's not set in place prior to their release, ultimately that's when things can kind of go downhill. So I'm always a massive advocate for things to be in place via technology. And technology, I'm not just talking about tablets and devices, it's how the whole prison is operated, the systems, how you can communicate, family ties. Well, again, for me, one of the things that I like to throw out is the art of the possible. Anything you would like to do in custody, technology can do it. Today, they can do it. But obviously, there are loads of blockers, there's loads of challenges, but it can be done. Why can't you, if you have a course, a practical course, and obviously, and you can't, for one reason or another, you can't get access or you can't attend this course due to infrastructure, due to environment, why can't there be a virtual reality? Like if you're doing some sort of like a mechanic course or things like that, why can't you put on some goggles and you can effectively be carrying out the practical session? Sally mentioned earlier, driving theory. It's really bad how something as simple as that, you can't access. However, but I know there are SMEs and there are organizations that can provide that. They can provide that to help. So there are loads of small companies, loads of organizations that can provide everything that they're after. But unfortunately, it does come from a place where the culture is not quite right yet. The culture is not quite right. I think that's where we need to really shift and really kind of look into pathways for me. And how long do I have, Kevin?
Can you, is it okay if you wrap up there? Is that
no,
okay,
I can't.
Mandy?
Sorry, mate. No, I'm joking. Yeah, so I've got so much to say, but I would kind of end on how I started, okay. Which is the whole system approach. Whole system approach, it comes from before you enter the establishment, is how that data follows you, is how the support is offered to you, is how that's able to translate into tailored support data. Again, when you are then go at a system and you do come out, how is that data followed? Do they know about you? Are you able to get the right support that you've been receiving for the time you've been there? So I think we need to talk more. Technology is there to make things simple and easier. It should not complicate things, but at the same time, organizations should talk to each other and help that young person or adult through that process. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Nandi, for your input there. That's really helpful. And thanks for kind of closing there. Okay, so because I want to make sure that we kind of have time for Anina to talk through some of the things from our director's report, I'm going to kind of try and manage this next Q&A session so that we kind of just have questions and answers and just in a sort of 10-minute slot. Just looking at the chat here, what I'm going to suggest is that if I kind of maybe identify what the question and the questioner, then if I can ask the question, and then we'll start off with a question here from Marie Claire, and then see if the other panelists have something they can say to that, and then I might pick up one other question because I think that might take us to the sort of 10 minutes. So I think it was Alex again, Alex Rose. Alex, do you want to ask your question, Marie Claire, and when she's answered, maybe we can open it out to the other panel members. Over to you, Alex. If Jamie can unmute you. There you go.
Thank you, Kevin. Just a quick question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what does good peer, a kind of peer-led employment support looks like, because I just think it'd be great just to kind of understand the approach and principles, and it'd be great to hear your thoughts on how that could be more embedded in service delivery within the criminal justice space. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. So the first thing is I think it's really important as a mechanism in terms of exposing serving prisoners and recently released prisoners to what rehabilitation looks and feels like. So, ultimately, we as ex-prisoners mirror rehabilitation in action and mirror what is possible for our clients. And that's a really important mechanism in terms of inspiring aspirational thinking and, really setting the spark alight, if you like. So I think the more that we can expose prisoners to ex-prisoners that are doing well in life, the better. But also I think good peer-led approaches look like holistic as well as practical support. So that's what we do. We tackle some of the immediate barriers such as lack of photographic ID, benefits applications. Housing is obviously a huge barrier, and so on and so forth. So we really put some practical actions into place, but then also we support holistically with peer mentors that have been there, done it, worn the t-shirt, to really provide the love and the care that people need, and that assistance theory tells us is so important in helping people to reduce and stop crime. So that kind of two-pronged attack, if you like, is must go hand in hand, holistic and practical support. And just going back to what a few speakers have said, including Nandi, about the through the gate support. So, you know, we've got a resettlement helpline, free phone helpline that we've got up and running in Birmingham, and it basically allows prisoners to have something which they don't have a lot of whilst in custody, which is autonomy and allowing them to plan for their own resettlement, because quite often that's dictated to them by the resettlement, you know, the CMs and the OMs in the establishment, however good or bad they are. And we know that it's usually the latter, if we're being honest, because, you know, that's why the reunifications happened. So it's about that pre-release accessibility, giving them access to people like us so that we can tell them what's available and support that transition, but also the post-release support. For me, the departure lounge model that we've got up and running at Birmingham works really well, where Lynn, our support worker, who's also an ex-prisoner, she's stationed in reception, would, you know, immediately release prisoners to the service and other, you know, other agencies and partners that we work with, engaging them, and then it's up to them. They voluntarily engage or they don't engage, and more often than not they do engage because they like what we say, you know, they like what we're saying, they like what we do. And the prison grapevine is brilliant at weeding out the good services from the bad, and luckily we're classed as a good service, so we get a lot of referrals that way.
Andy, a quick word from you.
Yeah, just to add on the departure lounge, one thing we did, Mary Claire, was at Brixton we used prison radio to ask the guys what they wanted to call it, because we were going to call it a departure lounge, and quite a lot of the guys said, well, what's that? And we realised quite a few guys had never been on a plane or to an airport, so they didn't know what a departure lounge was. So they voted to call it a Fresh Start Centre, so that's what ours is called. But thoroughly agree that model of having a safe space, you know, on just outside the gate where people can access support, you know, on the day they leave, is really, really important. And I think, you know, for Adam, I think that's something well worth investing in across the prison estate, especially for the resettlement prisons.
Okay, great, thanks for that. So I'm going to go to probably what's going to be a final question, actually. So Cara, I think you had a question or comment. So I wonder if Jamie, if you could perhaps just unmute Cara, and then if you'd like to kind of ask your question or just your comment.
Very briefly, just in terms of the families, I think that while we continue to view families as tools for rehabilitation, we're not acknowledging their experience, we're not supporting them effectively, because all we're doing is seeing them in relation to the prisoner and the prison, and that's not the case. 50% of our cases don't even go to a prison, they have no contact with the person in prison. But just in terms of children impacted by parental imprisonment, if we're really, really serious about reducing intergenerational crime, then surely we need to focus on those children. And of the children, nearly 600 children that we've supported through Children Heard and Seen, the reduction in intergenerational crime from 65% to 0.4% speaks for itself, I think. And at the moment, we only have an estimate of the number of children that are impacted by parental imprisonment, and that's 312,000 of them. We don't have an official number because there is no statutory requirement to identify, register, support the children, and there is no government department that actually takes responsibility for them. So in terms of a white paper and suggestions for what should happen in the future, supporting those children, not in relation to a prison, but supporting those children in their communities and identifying who they are and what their needs are is key, I think.
Thanks for that, Cara. And any of the panel members want to come back on that at all? Andy?
Yeah, I think Cara's absolutely right. It's something we've been saying for a long time now. Obviously, we're talking about a prisons white paper, and so it's very specific, but there is that issue that whichever government minister we write to about prisoners' children, they will tend to say that it is the other minister you should be writing to. There's nobody in government who holds the brief for prisoners' children. And I'd add to that prisoners' younger siblings as well, because younger siblings can get very badly affected by the experience of contact with the police, with the justice system, and possibly, and sometimes with the offending behaviour in the family home prior to that in some cases. So we do have to get serious about it. Somewhere between 200 and 300,000 children, we don't know. One very simple thing is we should stop thinking that we need to pilot proper pre-sentence reports and we should just do them like we used to. Pre-sentence reports used to be proper written pre-sentence reports for courts used to be absolute standard practice, and they would explain what where the children were, what the impact might be on them, and maybe who might be expected to care for them if their parent went into custody, whereas we currently just leave children behind. I just want to find a point on this. You can have, Shona Minson is very good on this. She points out that you can have a family court next to a criminal court. In the family court, they're talking about the paramount interests of the child in every sentence, in every conversation. It's the Children Act, paramount interests of the child. In the criminal court, we can send a primary care or a lone parent to prison and not even check who's looking after the children, and that's a disgrace.
Thanks, Andy. That's a very critical, important point there. So I'm just going to kind of draw this part of the kind of today's meeting to a close there. Thanks very much for the comments, for chats. Thanks again to the panel members for speaking and contributing. It's been very interesting, very helpful, and also very informative.